Elliot Brooks just posted a great video on the subject of escapism and trauma and fantasy, and she brought up Mistborn as an example that inspired her and connected deeply with her. It was a very heartfelt video, and this made me think of a more general question about how mental illnesses are depicted in popular fantasy novels. I'm Eric Goodwin, and by day, I'm a practicing psychiatrist, a Jungian scholar and lecturer, but by night, I'm a fantasy author. And I wish I could say that I made that joke up, but that actually came from Jim Scriven over at his great channel, Fantasy for the Ages, and his review of my book, King of Forgotten Darkness. You should check it out. The book, by the way, is available for digital download now and will be in brick and mortar stores and physical copies online starting on the 1st of April. So go check that out and go check out Jim's channel. In any case, welcome to the Imaginarium. Here I'm talking about all the stuff I just said, especially as it relates to fantasy fiction. As I like to say, before there were mental health professionals, there were storytellers. Okay, but what about modern fantasy novels? What in modern fantasy deals with mental health issues? Well, as it turns out, this question is a lot more complex than you might think on the surface. Ms. Brooks brings up Mistborn, and I intend to review Mistborn in future videos, but in Mistborn, we do have a clear-cut depiction of someone with a lot of severe abuse in her past in the character of Vin. And so we see her behave in ways that are actually very common in such cases. She makes herself small, she flees from stereotypically feminine behaviors because it draws attention to itself. She also flees from it because she perceives it as weak or frivolous. But then at the same time, she discovers that being girly is actually kind of fun. And I think this works in The Final Empire and Mistborn in general because Sanderson's magic system is very mechanical and predictable. It's a hard system in his terminology. Now, I'm going to get to why this is so important in a minute. But what about Sando's other works? Wind and Truth, for example, has taken a lot of flack for Sanderson's depiction of mental illness and therapy in that book. Criticism I've heard of it are that it's extremely on the nose, it's often very modern sounding. I'm going to withhold judgment on that because I am way behind in the Stormlight archive, and Sanderson's books are so long, they require a huge time commitment. I will get to them, but I'm pretty far behind at this point. I've only read Way of Kings. But even in that book, I thought that he did a pretty good job depicting what modern mental health labels as depression, complete with self-harm thoughts and so forth. And he does dig into a lot of flashbacks, and I mean a lot of flashbacks, and gives us a background in a fairly realistic way. So in both of these cases, we have a pretty straightforward, if somewhat unnuanced depiction of depression and some elements of what happens to trauma survivors. There's a whole lot more that you could do with it, but it could be more nuanced and fleshed out, yes. But Sanderson's deliberate writing style choice to keep things simple, direct, and comprehensible, and keeping the narrator invisible doesn't quite lend itself to the kind of deep character dives or wading through complex, challenging behavioral dynamics. He's trying to tell an adventure story. So it makes perfect sense that he wrote it the way he did. So on the surface level, it's pretty good, which is really all you can ask, because he's trying to tell an epic fantasy story. He's not getting into a deep, complex treatise on mental health issues, and it obviously works. They're very popular books. So, giving a large dose of poetic license, I would say that in that context, he's pretty accurate in broad strokes. And he accomplishes what he's trying to do for the purposes of an action-adventure focused story. Not only that, he brings awareness and attention to mental health issues, which I really like, being a mental health practitioner. But here's the thing. I do think that accuracy in mental health depictions of fiction are important. But there's one really big, I think, issue that is very important in this instance, and that is these are fantasy stories that we're talking about here. Fantasy is different from other genres. Let me explain what I mean. In any genre that you're writing, it's a good idea to try to strive for accuracy in mental health issues. Okay? But in fantasy, we have some different elements here. And now, obviously, as fantasy fans, we don't dismiss the fantasy genre because we know that there's deeper meaning to it, or there can be. We can feel it very frequently, which is why we're big fans of it. But I think I can tell you why that is, and it has to do with our universal and human psychology and our dependence on symbol, image, and metaphor to understand the human experience on a deep level. Fantasy is actually unique among genres because we don't have to worry about the confines of physics or so-called realism. A fantasy story can be anything, and anything can happen. But this is also its weakness. It's easy for it to fall into frivolous wish fulfillment or arbitrary chimerical nonsense just for aesthetics and rule of cool. So what does this mean? Well, it means that mental illnesses do not have to be depicted realistically to be accurate, so long as the fantasy elements contain the symbolic within them. Let me explain what I mean by that. Fantasy fiction draws upon the same creative impulse behind the dreaming process. When we dream, our unconscious creates a narrative that depicts our inner emotional reality in external, concrete, visuospatial metaphors. So if I'm internally feeling down in the dumps, I might dream of externally being in a dumpster. Or if I am internally struggling with a huge life decision to make, I might dream of externally being at a crossroads. If I'm really conflicted internally, I might dream of having an argument or even a battle with an abstract other character who represents me on some level against myself. These are all very common dream narrative forms that I see in therapy. Now, here's the trick. Fantasy does this too. Inner struggles between a desire for love and a desire to be powerful becomes the external struggle to destroy the One Ring or resist the dark side of the Force. An inner turmoil associated with a coming of age, say, becomes the external adventure that you see in trilogies like Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. The inner struggle for forgiveness and redemption against the inner hell of shame and self-doubt becomes an external struggle to literally escape hell in Chris Buhlman's Between Two Fires, for example. Great book. The brain does this because this process helps us understand the meaning of our current situation. It's a way that we can make sense of all the conflicting information and process and emotions that's going on inside. So it's actually a process of meaning construction. So then what, Dr. G, does this have to do with mental health and fantasy fiction, you ask? Well, consider that depression is actually a modern term. Just like post-traumatic stress disorder used to be called shell shock or combat neurosis or battle fatigue in the past, depression has gone by all kinds of other names in other cultures and times throughout history. And just as variable are the explanations and the treatments for it too. Thus, if we want to depict mental health issues in a fantasy, we have a potential problem because fantasy has the ability to depict inner emotional transformations and challenges as external, concrete, symbolic narratives. It is very good at that. Yet, if we want to be realistic about the depictions of mental health issues in fantasy, we can get tangled up once we start introducing magic and monsters and alternate dimensions and fairy tale objects and all that, because those things are also usable to symbolize inner dynamics. So we have potentially two different languages competing with each other. The unique strength of fantasy then can also be a hindrance if you're too concerned about realism, interestingly enough. Let me use an example to explain what I mean. Take the traditional Senegalese ritual known as the Ndeup. If a person behaves in a manner that we would label as depression, the Lebo people perform an Ndeup for them, as it is known within that society that such suffering is actually caused by spirits who have attached themselves to your body. The Ndeup requires the entire village to participate in a ritual which is designed to overwhelm the subject emotionally, but then help them release the sadness-causing spirits so that the subject can then feel better. And in that context and in that culture, that treatment actually works. There's a really great video that I'll share in the link below by psychologist Andrew Solomon, who actually went through this ritual And check that video out. It's really interesting. It describes the ritual in detail, and it's really wild. Now, take a look at those explanations and the cure. That's magic, folks. This is fantasy. This is the kind of stuff we read about in our favorite novels. But those people are not burdened with the cognitive baggage that we have in the West that says, this is realistic, but this is fantasy. In other words, the only things that are real for us are mechanical, mindless, and devoid of anything outside human psychological projections. But that's actually a very rare worldview if you compare systems around the world. The more common worldview seen in indigenous cultures, present and past cultures, are ones where spirits and magic are just another part of the natural world. It's not magical realism. It's just realism to them, because magic is just as real as everything else. Magic ritual solutions to depression, such as the Ndeup or the Leech Book charms of the 10th century Old English time period, or maybe even the rune staves of the Havamal and Old Norse tradition, charms and shamanistic cures in general, all often referred to behavioral patterns that we would call mental illness. But in those cultures, they don't frame it like that. And their treatment is very different too. It's not antidepressants or cognitive therapy. It's rid oneself of the harmful spirit, release the magical burden of a harmful object, or maybe be marked by an encounter with a dragon to demonstrate one's readiness to transition from Simon Mooncalf to Simon Snowlock, boy to man in symbols. Those so-called hero's journey style stories are often reflections of coming of age rituals. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that the word mental illness is itself a modern conceptual approach that accordingly has a lot of modern conceptual baggage that doesn't exist in other cultures and might sound odd in a fantasy culture. Nevertheless, you can still make it work. And I'll use Sanderson's example here. Vin and her PTSD. It still works in that story, but that's because the magic in the Mistborn world is mechanical and science-like. The two languages then, the symbolic and magical and the more modern, are not clashing or interfering with each other in that. Now, it's the magical system is not 100% mechanical and science-like. There are some symbolic elements to it that Sanderson preserves, like the idea that those powers are only unleashed by terrible trauma. This is itself a symbolic depiction of how trauma can unlock great and terrible instincts that evolve to help us be protected in the long run. They are costly defenses. So there is still this kind of dream connection there. It's just subtle. Now, as a reminder, if you are enjoying this stuff, consider giving my video a like and maybe subscribing. Stay tuned. I got lots more of this kind of stuff. Anyway, the point of all this is that good fantasy uses magic, monsters, and other so-called impossible things to do what dreams do, which is translate confusing, complicated, and confounding inner challenges and impressions into external, concrete, visual-spatial narratives. It does this because this process gives you the ability to depict those kind of deep mysteries with greater clarity. All stories do this to some degree, particularly ones that are interested in theme, but fantasy can do this with the greatest precision because fantasy is unhindered by the worries of so-called realism. The inner can be directly translated imagistically into the external without comment because, well, it's magic. But this also means that because of the way modern westernized societies conceptualize mental health, if we want to include themes of mental illness, trauma, and recovery in a fantasy story, we have to decide which parts of it, if any, we're going to fantasize and which parts we aren't. If you want to commit to the modern Western definitions of depression and its treatment, for example, then you're going to have to avoid using the power of fantastical expression to do it, because modern understandings of mental illness don't include spirits and spells and magic objects. But ancient and indigenous cultures, however, did and do use such things, and they're fully incorporated into the lexicon of mental illness, or what we would call mental illness. Is this perhaps the problem with Wind and Truth? Does Sanderson lean so heavily on the modern framing of mental health issues that the fantasy suffers as a result? I don't know. Like I said, I haven't gotten that far in Stormlight Archive, but I will. In any case, I'd be surprised. Now, I may sometimes struggle with Sanderson's pacing. I feel sometimes maybe he sacrifices lyricism and subtext for simplicity. But there is no doubt he's a very talented writer, and those are quibbles that are really just me problems. Obviously, he connects on a deep level with a lot of folks. He's very popular, and he has a very loyal following. And, that's sign that he's got talent. I'm going to have to play catch up to say for sure. But what about my novel? Well, in King of Forgotten Darkness, I take this principle and I add a layer to it. Liam, a main character, because he has witnessed his family being murdered, suffers from severe PTSD. Here's how the opening crawl of the book begins. There's always been two worlds. Our beloved Midworld, which is an advanced realm of reason, logic, and peace, and Arantir, a primitive realm of dark magic and war. After ages of Arantir inflicting conflict and suffering on us, the Magnaland Council finally managed to shut all 12 gates between the worlds. Peace reigned in Midworld for decades. 9-year-old Liam was the last refugee to cross the worlds before the last gate was closed, putting Arantir's horror behind him. But 15 years later, those horrors could be ignored no longer. Now, knowing what you know, you might be able to tell how I weave the theme of mental illness into King of the Forgotten Darkness in a way that addresses trauma and recovery, but uses magical elements to do it in a way that the two languages of westernized mental health and the magical and mystical don't interfere with each other. It's a fine balancing act. Since Liam learns as a young adult that one family member actually survived and needs him, he has to illegally return to Arantir, which means facing his deepest inner demons in the flesh and not just in nightmares. Now, as a psychiatrist, by day, of course, I'm very interested in exploring mental health issues in fiction. As a fantasy fan, I'm excited to use all the tools that the best genre, can give us to do it. I think Vin's journey in Mistborn is a good blend. Sanderson's choice of magic system complements his examination of mental health themes in that instance in Vin's arc. But hopefully I've managed to convince you that it's really not as straightforward as you might think on the surface, especially with mental illness. Given that mental illness has been, for the majority of human history, a magical and spiritual issue. So if you blend the modern framing of mental health with fantasy, you really have to be careful about how you do it, because the two languages can undermine each other. Last, I want to end with this. I want to really emphasize here that good fantasy is not really escapism. Now, Ms. Brooks mentioned this in relation to her own traumatic experiences, in which she said that she escaped from her awful situation with her favorite stories. And if you're watching this, Elliot, we support you. You found your strength. But I have to say, well-written stories it's not so much that they help us escape from our pain, they actually help us heal it. And I mean something specifically when I say heal. Healing doesn't mean you just get over it. This may actually surprise you, but we don't really resolve inner conflicts or past traumas so much as we outgrow them. Whereas in the beginning, right after a trauma, the trauma itself may feel like a huge black hole that's threatening to consume everything that you are. But with time and healing and therapy, however you define that, you get better. In one culture, that might be intense psychotherapy or hypnotherapy or whatever. In another culture, it might be an Ndeup, or it might be a magic charm of some kind. In any case, as you get better, that black hole doesn't become smaller. You become larger. You expand, grow, and the wound becomes so tiny that it only bothers you every once in a while. And when it does, just know that that is completely normal. And it is a part of you, always will be, but you are a whole lot more than that in the end. So that's what I got for you on the subject of mental health in fantasy. There's much more I could say about this, and I'll probably put together some more videos like this if you want to hear it. And until next time, I'll see you later, gang.